Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilman is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and this is my crafting guide for the Witchwood. Now, to be specific, this is not a crafting guide for the Witchwood meta. This guide will only be addressing cards that were actually released in the Witchwood. I'm going to talk about legendaries, rares, and epic cards that you should craft. I am not going to be talking about things that you should be disenchanting, and I'm not going to be talking about every card either. I'm only going to focus in on the cards that I specifically think are worth adding to your collection. These are cards that are going to be important parts of high-tier decks, or just cards that are going to be fundamentally solid pieces in your collection that will be useful both now and in the future. That said, I am going to be rating these cards across 3 different tiers so that you have some metric to understand which cards might be the most valuable of your collection, or which cards you might want to craft the most, or in fact, which cards might be the safest to craft. So that said, let's go ahead and talk about these tiers, starting off with Tier 1 cards. These are going to be the very best of the best. They're in meta-defining decks. They've completely reshaped how we play Hearthstone, and they're incredibly low risk to craft. In other words, I think they will be around for a long time or be important parts of the meta. They're very unlikely to fall out of favor as the game shifts. We've also got Tier 2 cards. Now, these are still really, really good, and in fact, every card in this video is going to be good. But with Tier 2 cards, they're still powerful. They can perhaps be a part of Tier 1 decks and be very prominent and important cards in those decks, but they do have some limits. In other words, class cards are only ever going to be Tier 2 in my mind. Even amazing cards like Voidlord and Call to Arms are still only Tier 2 cards for me because they can't be run across every class. That doesn't make them the best cards to have in your collection because you're limited and restricted in how you can use them. So essentially they do have limits, and sometimes neutral cards can fall in that camp as well. Perhaps they only work in a single archetype or one deck. And then finally we have Tier 3 cards. These are still really good. They get played. They're important parts in good decks, but they are risky for some reason or another. Perhaps they've only really showed up in one deck so far, so we're not 100% sure they're going to stick around forever. Or maybe there's something where they're tied to a card that could rotate out eventually. They're good now. They're probably going to pay off for you. They're usually safe crafts, but they do have a little bit more risk than the cards in the higher tiers. So all that said, let's go ahead and talk about legendary cards first. And when it comes to the Witchwood, there are actually some pretty good legendaries that are worth crafting. Starting off in the Tier 1 set for me, up first is Baku the Moon Eater. Fantastic card, has created a ton of different decks already, some of which are very prominent in the meta, including Odd Rogue, Odd Paladin, even Odd Hunter, and Odd Warrior. All of these Baku decks are either Tier 1 or Tier 2 decks, usually Tier 2 decks at the moment. But clearly Baku is the kind of card that's going to be good now and is honestly going to get even better. As more and more cards come out, Baku will get stronger because it'll be easier to build odd decks. And then following Baku, we have his partner in crime, Gin Greymane, the other start of game synergy card here. Gin Greymane, of course, even decks instead of odd decks, but still, there's things like even Shaman and even Warlock, which are fringe decks, but then of course the most prominent of all is even Paladin, which is really the best deck in the Witchwood right now. It has the highest win rate and one of the highest played rates as well. So Gin Greymane is empowering essentially the best deck in the game, and also a handful of other decks, and again, much like Baku, will just continue to get better. So both of these cards are not only meta-defining, but they seem like they're going to be strong for the foreseeable future. You almost can't go wrong crafting either of these right now. Now, when it comes to Tier 2 legendaries, there's really only one that makes the cut. It is Warlock's Lord Godfrey, and this guy's become a really dominant force in 2 versions of Warlock, which are pretty similar, Cube Lock and Control Lock, each of which run a lot of the same cards, but have slightly different variations of themselves. But Lord Godfrey just serves as a perfect board removal sort of tool. Also, sometimes killing your own stuff can be really good in Warlock. So the downside of hurting your own things, Lord Godfrey, is really not even that relevant. So the perfect kind of card for Warlock, a deck in class that didn't really need any more good cards, but they got him with Lord Godfrey. Absolutely a safe craft if you're ever playing a Warlock. It would probably be a Tier 1 card, but again, just because it only works in one class, I just can't put it in that top row. And now for Tier 3 cards. Honestly, these only very barely made the cut, and I've only got a couple. Up first is Darius Crowley, a card that's clearly being run in Rush Warrior, which is kind of a tier 2, maybe tier 3 deck at the moment. And although that's playable and Crowley is obviously a really important part of Rush Warrior, it's still a bit of a fringe meta deck, and there is a lot of risk that if no more Rush cards get printed and that keyword falls short, then Crowley could fall even farther out of favor in the future, so he might not make the cut. I still think he's a good card on average. You can still stick this thing into other Warrior decks, so I think he's a little bit immune to that problem, but may not become the most played card ever in the future. Moving on to the second card, we have the Glass Knight, in some ways very similar to Crowley, but even safer because, at the end of the day, the Glass Knight is a decent 4-mana minion, even if you never activate his effect. Yes, he's better if you put him in a heal synergy style of Paladin where you can do that, even if it's just a True Silver Champion proc here or there, or a Lifesteal proc here or there. The Glass Knight gets better. But he is being run in things like Even Paladin in some lists, and just various other versions of Paladin, like control lists and mid-range lists. So the Glass Knight seeing some play similar to levels of Darius Crowley. Neither of them are in like super awesome high-tier decks that consistently. Neither of them are dominating the meta by any means, but they both just look like solid cards for their class that are going to get some play at some level down the road and currently. Now, some people might be asking why cards like Countess Ashmore aren't on this list. Well, believe it or not, despite the fact that Countess Ashmore feels like an incredibly safe card, she's big and good and cool and seems all fine, she's just not seeing enough play right now. I cannot defend including her even as a tier 3 card. She's getting played less than both Crowley and Glass Knight, and frankly, a handful of other class legendaries that didn't even make the cut. So, although I personally think Ashmore will be good someday, she's just not good enough right now. So now let's move on to epic cards. And when it comes to tier 1 epic cards, there aren't any. There's no awesome meta-defining neutral epic card this time around. You know, we had a few last expansion with things like Corridor Creeper, and I think Spiteful Summoner eventually became that sort of card and still remains a tier 1 craft card from Kobolds and Catacombs. Those were both just really meta-dominant forces. Of course, Corridor Creeper got nerfed, no longer would be a tier 1 card. But in this expansion, there's nothing that's just that good, or that you have to include in your collection, or that really empowers or defines a bunch of different decks. So we just have the X there for tier 1. When it comes to tier 2, we do have a couple options. Up first is the Voodoo Doll. This is a nice neutral epic, but because this is the sort of neutral epic that really only fits in specific archetypes, specifically control kinds of archetypes, but also in classes that have some way to easily activate the Voodoo Doll by killing it. So for instance, a mage with a ping or warlock with defile. A lot of classes don't have that reliable activation. So Voodoo Doll does have some limits on its applications. Not everybody can use it, not every class. So a good card that is seeing a surprising amount of play. The percentages on this one surprised me. A lot of different decks are managed to squeeze this in. Primarily, I think, driven by Control Warlock, but also Big Spell Mage with Jaina in particular is using Voodoo Doll very successfully. So a couple pretty high tier decks there finding this thing useful, and that will probably stay the case for a long time. So a nice little epic card to have in your toolkit if you ever plan to play Control or focus on those classes. Another option for tier 2 epic cards is Nightmare Amalgam. Now this might just look like kind of a throwaway card. It is ultimately just a 3-mana 3/4 with the occasional synergy, but it's seeing a lot of play because that occasional synergy is actually rather strong, because it becomes a decent Murloc body. So things like Murloc Paladin can successfully use Nightmare Amalgam. And then it also becomes a dragon body often right now in the meta. So the fact that it can be a decent dragon activator for different dragon synergy cards is important, because we just don't have that many different dragons in the pool. So a couple decks that rely on those synergies, like, you know, Spiteful Dragon Priest, for instance, or Murloc Paladin, suddenly find a use for Nightmare Amalgam. This might be the closest thing to a tier 1 epic card of this expansion, but at the end of the day, it's just not that strong. Not every class or deck is going to want to use this thing. It's certainly no Corridor Creeper. It's just not reshaping how the meta looks, but it is definitely a solid card, a reliable card, and strong enough that it might just be worth the craft, because it does fit into a handful of different decks, and it will remain relevant in the future too. Maybe there's totem decks or pirate decks or beast decks or demon decks that eventually want to use this thing. Elementals too, I guess, even. Shoot, they're all there. So Nightmare Amalgam is a good thing to have around. And finally, when it comes to tier 3 cards, there's really only a couple here. The epics are actually rather disappointing in the Witchwood, and in fact, maybe cards on average are somewhat disappointing in the Witchwood. But up first, we have the Arcane Keysmith. This is a card I personally don't really still like all that much, but it is seeing play in a couple different versions of Mage. Big spell mages like this thing just because it's, I guess, kind of a mid-rangey value minion that can give you a secret that's sometimes useful. And it's actually, believe it or not, also seeing some play in tempo mage lists. So since it's seeing play across multiple archetypes, I figured it's worth a nod as a tier 3 card. The percentage and play rate for it is rather high as well, so clearly people are enjoying this one and finding some utility out of it, even though to this day it still surprises me. So I turned my own personal biases aside to make Arcane Keysmith make the cut here. And then also we have the Town Crier as a tier 3 card. Now I personally love Town Crier. I think this is an incredible card. Decent stats on a 1-drop that draws you a very specific thing that synergizes with your deck. That's awesome. That's so cool. The only downside here, the risk, I guess, for Town Crier is that it's a rush card. If rush doesn't work, if there's not other good rush minions, this thing might not be worth it in the future. But that said, we already know there's some good reliable rush minions like Darius Crowley, and as long as Darius Crowley is good, a card like Town Crier is good too. So I think the risk is somewhat limited. This isn't just played in rush decks either. I've seen this even in odd warrior or just big control warrior decks as well, where just including a couple rush minions is relevant and successful. So Town Crier is the perfect sort of early game minion to play, and that's why it's here in the tier 3 spot. So now let's move on to some rare cards. And once again with rare cards, I'm sorry to say there just aren't any tier 1 rare cards. There's nothing that's that synonymous with the Witchwood meta that's everywhere, that's like a card you have to own. It just doesn't exist. Now, when it comes to tier 2 cards, on the other hand, I think there are quite a few inclusions. So let's move through these a little quicker, perhaps, than past examples. Up first, we have the Scale Worm. This is the Tar Creeper Sweeper of the Witchwood meta thus far. A card that has shown up in a couple different versions of Dragon decks, most notably, I would say, in Priest. It feels like a Priest card exclusively right now, but still being used very successfully and something you have to consider anytime you play Priest. It's kind of the brother to Duskbreaker, where they now have 4-drop Dragon Synergy cards that are either good at killing a single thing or good at wiping your board. So it's been an important tool for Priest, but still the kind of thing that as long as dragons are around could be good in any given deck that utilizes Dragon Synergy. Moving on beyond that, we also have Life Drinker. This is another one of those cards that completely surprises me. Of course, this saw a ton of play right away in the Witchwood when everybody was trying out Shudderwalk OTK combos. That has since gone away. Hardly anybody really plays that anymore. But there are still people using Life Drinker in aggressive decks like Tempo Mage that's trying to kill you. It's showing up in Hunter occasionally even as well because it does have that inevitable 3 damage for 4 mana. I'm still, again, not convinced that's very good. If Nightblade wasn't good, why is Life Drinker so much better? I'm not sure. Clearly it is better because you get some life gain and it's a lower cost minion, but it doesn't seem that much better. That said, other people are using it successfully and running it, so it certainly seems like the kind of card that might be worth a craft. Moving beyond that, we have Witchwood Piper. This is just one of those cool tutor-style cards that's good in a lot of different kinds of decks because it allows you to find specific sorts of things. So it's being played right now, but also it's just a card that's good to have around. Particularly, it's so cheap to craft as a rare card that it's just a good one to have in your back pocket. Anytime you might need to slot in some card draw, Witchwood Piper could really fill that gap nicely. We also have a couple class cards here, starting off with Silver Sword. This one surprises me, but of course this is being played very successfully in Even Paladin in particular as a nice finisher and follow-up tool. When you build those giant boards of dudes, Silver Sword both gives you pressure to hit the face, often with that 3 damage, and also buffs a board. Usually it seems like 3 or 4 or 5 minions, so a great tool in that kind of deck. It's served very nicely, and I think can extend beyond that even. As long as Paladin has ways to build a wide board, Silver Sword is exactly the kind of card that serves as a good follow-up. So it is definitely worth it if you play Paladin. Beyond that, we have Cinderstorm, actually another card that surprises me here. It is the bigger brother to Arcane Missiles that is seeing a lot of play in, well, Mage obviously, but Tempo Mage in particular, as a kind of dual purpose card, I would say. It's good sometimes for hitting the opponent's face when you're looking to squeeze in some extra damage, but it's also really good in a Paladin-driven meta where there are a lot of 1 health minions out there that Cinderstorm essentially allows you to clear up pretty nicely and tidily. So a good tool for Mage. And then finally, one last neutral card here with the Witchwood Grizzly. This one isn't seeing what I would describe as a ton of play, but it's still popping into decks here and there, as I could tell from its played percentage in the meta right now. So some people are finding uses for this thing as an anti-aggro defensive sort of tool. I've seen it run in Druid, I think most commonly, but I think a handful of other people just squeeze this thing in as a meta answer, essentially, to a lot of the faster decks out there. So a good thing to have, again, just as a sort of filler piece anytime you're looking to counter a more aggressive meta or some specific aggressive meta deck. And then finally, I think there are a couple Tier 3 class card rares that are worth crafting as well. The first of those is the Witching Hour for Druid. This is really, though, only in one deck right now, and it's kind of a fringe deck at that, with Taunt Druid used most notably to resummon a Hadronox and allow you to build giant boards really cheaply with Hadronox and Carnivorous Cube. But because this is such a defining card and a vitally important card for that deck, and that is still a meta-relevant deck, Witching Hour might be worth the craft if that's the deck you want to play. It is so central and core to that deck that you can't get by without it. Beyond that, we have Nightscale Matriarch for Priest. This one, not seeing quite as much. It has a pretty low played percentage, but since it is a rare card, fairly cheap to craft, and looks like it's a good card despite its lower percentage, and of course helps power other Priest cards and archetypes like Duskbreaker or our buddy Scaleworm up there to its upper left. Nightscale Matriarch still looks like a solid card to have as a Priest player. It's potentially going to get better in the future too as more dragon cards come out. Not that it itself has a dragon synergy, but the more dragons there are often, the easier it is to support a dragon deck and include other dragons. So it can be propped up as a dragon archetype were to become more popular. And frankly, even if you don't have any other dragon cards, this also has heal synergies. So if other heal synergies come out there, this is another one of those cards that could get better based on various other cards being released, and it's already decent. A little bit risky, though, because you don't know that that's going to happen necessarily. Witching Hour, of course, also risky because if a Hadronox Druid Taunt Druid falls out of the meta, then Witching Hour might not be as useful. So there you go, guys. That actually wraps it up for my crafting guide for the Witchwood. I'm not going to talk about common cards, because they're just so cheap and easy to get in packs. You're going to fill out all the common cards you need really quickly, and you don't need my guidance there. Just craft it if you don't have it. I'm also not going to tell you which cards to disenchant. I think that would be incredibly irresponsible. I don't like recommending that you disenchant cards for 2 reasons. Number one, I don't know what's going to be good in the future. Anything could change. 3 months ago, I would have told you Hadronox was an easy disenchant, and now suddenly Hadronox is empowering a really fun, awesome, strong deck with Taunt Druid. So that's just crazy to recommend you disenchant things. I just can't get by that. Cannot support that. And secondly, when you disenchant cards, that means you can open them in packs again. So there's a little bit of risk there. If you keep a legendary, you'll never open it in a pack again. So you're going to have to disenchant based on your own judgments and decisions, and be careful because you might come to regret it later. So also you'll note I only recommended 17 cards to craft. Some people might be like, whoa, that's like no cards. Well, I'm sorry to say that's just the state of the Witchwood right now. Nothing is really that dominant or that powerful. This is a bit of a weaker expansion, and I definitely want to be safer rather than sorry when it comes to recommending crafting cards, because I don't want you to craft stuff that's going to end up being wasted, especially at the epic and legendary slot. Yeah, you can occasionally waste a rare because it's not that much dust, but you got to be careful when recommending those legendary or epic cards. Those can backfire big time if those things fall apart. So yeah, there's just not that much to recommend. I'm sorry, guys. That's just how it is for the Witchwood. Maybe that'll change in the future. Some of these cards might get better later. And, you know, future expansions, we'll never know what they hold, but hopefully more good cards to come in future sets. All of that said, of course, if you have thoughts, recommendations, questions, you should leave those in the comments below. You should always ask for a second opinion when crafting cards. Don't just take my word for it. Think critically about it. Look to other people's advice. Ask questions. Consider what you want to play and what you think is most fun, and go from there, because that's how you're going to build the best collection for you, the collection that makes you have more fun with the game, that helps you play decks and cards that you really want to play. That's the right way to do Hearthstone. So keep that in mind. All of that said, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.